everybody. Having watched Michael Bloomberg bomb a couple of short jokes, I'm going to not... I'm really honored to be here. Both of the co-hosts of today's event, both Prudential and the Aspen Institute, have been really catalytic supporters of the B Corp movement since the beginning. And they rank right up there with my Grandma Ruth, who on her deathbed gave us our first $30,000 grant. And I'll talk a little bit more about the catalytic roles that they've each played as I'm going through this. But it's a really, I'm honored to be here, and thank you. I also think it says a lot about the moment that there's such a large gathering of people who actually want to talk about a new capitalism. For most of the last 13 years, every time we wanted to have a conversation like that, there were like a large group meant like 2 or 3 people. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes and talk a little bit about background, because I'm not really like a likely person to be on this stage talking about building what is actually a social movement. I'm a private equity investor by background, and I spent 16 years making private equity investments on Wall Street. And I loved the rigor and the analysis and the strategy of making those kinds of investments and the relationship building. But I also came to doubt over time the increasingly single-minded focus on financial return in a financialized economy. And I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about like short-termism, but equally this long-term belief that the only thing material is financial returns, what I would call shareholder primacy, as if human aspiration or social justice or the planet existed only to serve capitalism as opposed to the other way around. And I came to start to see this as a systems failure with capitalism, likely not only to continue to leave behind so many marginalized people who capitalism has never actually served very well, but also ultimately to destroy the very system that has successfully lifted up billions of people out of poverty. The Crown Fellows program at Aspen and later the McNulty Prize at Aspen were 2 things that actually helped along in that journey and actually gave my 2 partners and me just enough moral courage to leave what we were doing in order to start B-Lab. And so in 2007, the 3 of us started a nonprofit, and that nonprofit was focused on this idea that there might be a better way of running the economy, that we might be able to build an inclusive and equitable or regenerative economic system for all people and for the planet. So I'm thrilled we're talking about a new capitalism. It's interesting to me that a very similar conversation is happening in a lot of other places around the world. I would say primarily in pretty elite places. And so whether it's the recent convening in Davos, or what we just said is going to happen at the Ideas Festival around this idea, or just about every major financial media platform having some series about reimagining capitalism or reinventing capitalism, or Larry Fink writing a letter to CEOs, or the Business Roundtable's recent declaration by 183 CEOs about stakeholder capitalism, or lots of billionaires who are fretting about the fact that capitalism isn't really working in the right way, or we need to reinvent it or reboot it. You can question whether they want to do that because they're patriots or because they're worried about the pitchforks, but one way or the other, it's a big conversation. And I think really importantly, policymakers. And it's not just policymakers on the left that are talking about the challenges of capitalism. From Josh Hawley to Elizabeth Warren and Mark Warner and Marco Rubio in between, there are a lot of politicians talking about the ills of shareholder primacy and looking for solutions. And at the heart of all of those conversations, I think, is a recognition of system failure. So the question is, how do we change the system? Or like a different way you might put that is, how do we have a capitalist reformation instead of a bloody populist revolution? And our view at B-Lab is that systems change, and this is like the theory of change language, requires 3 mutually reinforcing and interdependent threads that have to be woven together. That's what it's going to take to address the source code error of capitalism that Kathy Clark talked about, shareholder primacy, and replace it with an economic system that's actually creating benefit for all stakeholders, not just for shareholders. And those three things, as we think about it, are culture change. Like, we need to change the norms, the expectations of what the purpose of business is. The second thing is behavior change. Like, we actually need to see businesses changing the impact that they have on their most important stakeholders. And we need structural change, meaning, like, we can change lots of other things. If we don't change the rules of the game, if we don't change the policy environment in which business and the capital markets operate, we're likely not to have something that's meaningful and lasting. Each of those is insufficient alone. So the first era of B-Lab's work was not actually about trying to drive that kind of systems change at scale. It was really trying to build a model that we could look to. And so it was about building a credible community of leaders who could prove that model. It was about trying to get those leaders to take collective action on things like climate or inequality or racial inclusion. And it was about getting all of those businesses then to start to build power as advocates for structural change. So I think it's worked well for the last 13 years. There's a B Corp movement today that has over 3,000 companies. They're in 70 countries around the world, so it's a global movement. They represent every single industry, but they're united by one idea, that business can be used as a force for good. And increasingly, those companies are large multinationals with private equity or even public institutional capital. So I think we've successfully driven behavior and cultural change, but mostly by courageous leaders. And those courageous leaders have acted collectively to try to drive policy change, like creating new legal forms that make companies actually legally accountable to their stakeholders in 40 states and now in 4 countries around the world. And Prudential played a really critical role in catalyzing that work, but both through their investment fund, their social investment fund, and with philanthropy. But there's a lot of unfinished business. Changing the economic system means changing behavior and culture and structures at scale. And we haven't nearly done that. And so the next years are about that. It means ensuring that we have an inclusive economy, and that means racial equity. It's about engaging with multinationals. It's about driving collective action by businesses on the biggest challenges we face. It's about coalition building, because no one organization is going to lead a change in the way capitalism works. And finally, I would say it's about public policy. And all of those things are going to require significant infrastructure investments. And so, kind of like one of the Democratic candidates the other night, if you want to support that kind of work, you can go to www.bcorporation. No, I'm just kidding. So let me just talk briefly about, like, what's the opportunity right now, because the problem with systems change is it's going to take a generation, and there are a lot of things that have to happen that are going to take a long time. But the opportunity right now, I think, is that if we really want to take advantage of all of that fretting by billionaires, and all of the hand-wringing about the future of capitalism, and all the verbal commitments that we see from, like, the CEOs of the Business Roundtable, then it's up to all of us both to help them and to hold them accountable. And so some specific opportunities. The CEOs of the Business Roundtable and other public company leaders can go beyond a statement of intent. They can actually adopt stakeholder governance. They can actually make themselves legally accountable for considering those stakeholder interests, not just talking about purpose. And then they can manage and report their impact consistent with those legal accountabilities. In the capital markets, we talk a lot about short-termism and long-termism and maximization of value. The fact is that most investment fiduciaries are, in the end, investing on behalf of individual beneficiaries. And those people have a long-term interest not in the maximum financial performance of one company, but in the health of the market overall, in the resilience of the communities in which they live, and the quality and durability of their jobs. And so as fiduciaries, investment managers could actually act like that's the case. They can drive corporate behavior by considering social and environmental systems when they make their portfolio investment decisions. They can manage, they can actually engage with companies to get them to change their practices. And I think they can support CEOs who actually want to take on stakeholder governance. Like, they can actually endorse it, and they can go further than that. They can actually vote for it during proxy season. So there's a lot that they can do that goes beyond just talking about the fact that companies that they invest in need to have a purpose. And finally, public policy. The fact is, I think it's pretty hard to ask individual heroic CEOs to take a stand and change their behavior if there's not a level playing field. And it's equally hard to ask investment managers to consider a bunch of factors other than financial return if they're going to meet the fate of regulators or the market, if they're not going to allow them to do it. And so public policy matters, I think, in a big way. On March 9th, there are a number of people in this room who will be with us at the Ford Foundation to talk about how we create a long-term roadmap for policy changes that would actually enable businesses and investors in the capital markets to make their decisions based on the values that are value that's created for their stakeholders, not just their shareholders. So we've got to change the rules if we want to change the outcomes of the system we've got. So I just want to close by saying it's an amazing moment, right? There's a ton of energy. There's a lot of excitement about this idea of changing capitalism. And a lot of that conversation is happening in pretty elite spaces like this, but the pain and the vulnerability is mostly not in this room. And so it's important to keep those stakeholders in mind and work with them as we're making these kinds of decisions. This year, 2020, is the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's seminal essay in the New York Times. And in many ways, that's what we're talking about here, right? Like, what's actually the social responsibility of business or the social responsibility of the capital markets? And it's, I think, easy for lots of people to say that all we need to do is kind of like change the culture, and we'll have this pendulum swing from what Milton Friedman said to stakeholder capitalism. But I think it's a lot more deeply rooted than 50 years of Milton Friedman and culture shift. We're going to go tonight to the African American History and Culture Museum, and I'm pretty sure that we'll learn there that we have an economic system that was built not over the last 50 years, but over the last 400 years on human ownership, on appropriation of land, on exploitation of resources. And that seems to me like a system that is worth changing. Thanks very much.